Hello, beautiful souls. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Carolyn, and this channel is all about true crime, mystery, and anything abnormal. I highly recommend subscribing because this channel is definitely a vibe. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you who have been watching the videos, liking, commenting, subscribing. The channel is growing and I'm just so excited about it, and I couldn't do it without you guys. So please just know it really means the world to me to have you guys tuning in, watching these videos, and I love hearing your opinions on the cases. So I just wanted to say thank you so much. Susan and Jeff Wright's house on Berry Tree Drive looked perfect from the outside. Susan worked very hard, keeping the outside perfectly manicured. She took amazing care of beautiful flower gardens and the shrubs. And Jeff had actually been digging a hole because they were going to put a fountain in the backyard. So from the outside, things looked beautiful and perfect. The truth was, the things that were going on inside the home were extremely violent, dark, and disturbing. Today's story is about Susan Wright. Susan Wright was born April 24th, 1986 in Houston, Texas. Unfortunately, the home that Susan grew up in was not a healthy environment. Her father was extremely abusive to her mother. Her childhood very much foreshadowed her future. Susan was a people pleaser from a very young age. She would do anything she could to keep the people around her happy. And when she grew up and started having relationships, she would mold herself into whatever she thought the boy she was dating wanted her to be. When Susan was 17 years old, she was dating someone who wanted her to become a stripper. And this was not something that Susan had any interest in doing. But to please her boyfriend, she got a job as a topless dancer. Susan only kept this job for about 2 months because she had never wanted this job in the beginning. So when she quit working at the strip club, she got a job as a waitress in Galveston, Texas. In 1997, Susan was 21 years old. This is when she met 30-year-old Jeff Wright. Jeff had spent his teen years and early adulthood partying, drinking a lot, and doing a lot of substances. Jeff's drug of choice was coke, and this was something that he did from a young age and continued right up until his death. Jeff was also a very abusive partner, not unlike Susan's father. When Jeff and Susan began dating, Jeff became extremely controlling very quickly. Jeff wanted to control absolutely everything that Susan did. Susan enrolled in a nursing program in a community college, and this was something she was really excited about doing. However, Jeff was not as excited about the idea. Jeff was an extremely insecure man, and he did not like the idea of Susan going to school because she would be around other boys or men. So he forced Susan to drop out. And I think for Susan, this controlling, abusive behavior by Jeff was something that she was used to. She had witnessed it her entire life, watching her father do the same thing to her mother. So I think to Susan, it may have seemed like this was normal behavior, but Jeff was anything but normal behavior. He was a violent, abusive asshole. In 1998, Susan became pregnant and her and Jeff decided to get married. And you would think being pregnant for the first time, getting married. This would be an exciting, enjoyable time in your life. But unfortunately for Susan, this is when the physical abuse from Jeff began. After Jeff and Susan's son was born, they moved into a home in the White Oaks subdivision near Houston, Texas. Jeff was so insecure that he felt the need to control absolutely every aspect of Susan's life. If she wanted to go anywhere, she needed to ask his permission, and he would give her a time frame in which she could go. So, for example, say she needed to go to the grocery store to buy food for the family. He would give her a time limit, and she needed to be home by that time limit, or Jeff would fly into a rage. After Susan had given birth to their first son, she had suffered with postpartum depression, and having Jeff as her husband only made things worse. Susan decided to talk to her doctor about the difficulties that she was going through with the postpartum, and a doctor prescribed her a medication to help her. But Jeff refused to allow her to take the medication. He would constantly belittle her and call her fat and say that she needed to focus on losing weight to make her husband happy. While Susan spent her time at home taking care of her son, Jeff spent his time getting high, gambling, cheating on his wife, and he would then come home and tell Susan that it was her fault that he was cheating on her because she did not have her body back that she had before she had given birth, when she had literally just given birth to their son. Susan constantly had black eyes and bruises all over her body. Susan's mother noticed the black eyes and all the bruises, and she would ask Susan about them, but her mother was in an abusive relationship of her own that she couldn't get out of, so it didn't seem that she was much help to Susan in regards to that area. Cindy, who was Susan's sister, she seemed much more able to help Susan. One time, Cindy arrived at Susan's home just for a visit, and she noticed an enormous hole in the wall. And she asked Susan what happened. And Susan tried to say, oh, it must have been her son, who was very small, and Cindy knew right away it didn't make any sense that a little child could make such a huge hole in the wall. And eventually Susan confessed that Jeff, in one of his high-fueled rages, had actually picked Susan up and thrown her into the wall, and he threw her so hard that she went through the drywall. So this was an extremely dangerous situation that Susan was in. Susan's sister Cindy would try really hard to convince Susan to leave Jeff. But Susan, it wasn't that she didn't want to leave Jeff. She really believed that Jeff would kill her and their son if she ever left him. So she stayed with him not because she wanted to, she stayed with him because she was terrified of him. Susan became pregnant again, but Jeff's abuse did not stop or even become less when Susan was pregnant. And one time he had beat her so badly that she ended up miscarrying the second baby that she was pregnant with. Susan then became pregnant for a third time, and this time she had a daughter. And she was overjoyed to have her daughter and her son. But when she had her daughter, her postpartum came back, and it came back even worse. And she obviously was dealing with a partner who was making the situation even worse. he was just constantly belittling her, putting her down. Like, he was just an absolutely horrific, disgusting person who would attack his wife after she had literally just given birth to their child. Cindy, Susan's sister, became very, very concerned at this point. She was able to convince Susan, for her safety and the safety of now her 2 children, that she needed to leave Jeff. And Susan thought possibly this was a chance for her to finally get away from this man. Cindy rented a truck. She arrived at Susan's home when Jeff was not there, and she helped Susan get her and the children's things and move out of the house. As soon as Jeff found out that Susan had moved out, he called her and he told her she needed to come home immediately or he was going to kill her and her 2 children. And Susan knew that Jeff, he didn't make empty threats. He followed through on the threats that he made. So out of fear, she decided to move back in with Jeff. Jeff's abuse and his drug use continued to escalate, and Susan lived in constant fear, never knowing what to expect next. And Jeff started taking boxing lessons, and this is the last person in the world that needs to be taught how to punch better. This was a man who already did that to his wife. He was high all the time, completely out of control, but he was taking boxing lessons. And one day he came home from his boxing lesson and decided that he wanted to box with his 4-year-old son. Up until this point, Jeff's physical abuse had only been towards Susan. He had never physically abused either of the children. So when he decided he was going to box with his 4-year-old son, Susan, she kind of believed he was going to joke around and, kind of play the way you would play with a 4-year-old child. But no, Jeff punched his 4-year-old son in the face, knocking him down. And at that moment, it was like a switch went off in Susan's mind. And she knew at this point, it was one thing for him to abuse her, but she was never going to tolerate him abusing their children, and she was going to stop him. It was January 13th, 2003, when Jeff had punched his 4-year-old son. That night, he R-worded Susan, which is something he did on a regular basis to her. But this time, things ended very differently. And this is kind of where the story goes in 2 directions. So in Susan's version of events, after she was R-worded, she had gone to sleep and woken up with Jeff standing above her with a knife. Susan was able to get the knife away from him, and she ended up stabbing him to death in self-defense. The only problem is that she stabbed him 193 times. So that's not self-defense. At least it's not legally self-defense. So if you're going to go into a trial claiming that is self-defense, obviously 193 times, hard to sell that one as self-defense. In my personal opinion, it saved her life, and it probably saved both of her children's lives. Susan had stabbed Jeff all over his body. She had stabbed him in the chest, in the arms, in the legs, in his penis, in his face. And she said once she started stabbing him, she couldn't stop. She had this fear that even after he had passed, that he would come back to life and kill her. And the reason for the different areas of his body being stabbed was she, in this frenzy, she stabbed him in the leg for every time he had kicked her. She stabbed him in the penis for every time he had assaulted her sexually. She stabbed him in the arm for every time he had punched her. And it seems hard to imagine, how could someone possibly claim self-defense when there are that many stab wounds? And I know the thought that he could come back to life sounds pretty wild and unbelievable, obviously. But I've heard this before in cases where someone kills their abuser. They seem to have this belief that somehow, even though their abuser is dead, that they are still able to come back and hurt them. And I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's the idea that they have been living in constant terror every minute of their lives for so many years, that I think the amount of trauma that they've gone through, it really does affect their thinking and their beliefs. The prosecution, on the other hand, would claim that Susan had seduced him. She had tied him up to have some sexy time. Also, this whole trial was televised on court TV. So I think the prosecutor, she goes on and she's very dramatic, but I think in this situation, she was kind of looking for her 15 minutes of fame. Parts of the trial are on YouTube, so if you want to go and watch for yourself and see what you think, because Susan does testify and you get to see the dramatic DA. So you can go on and judge for yourself. But in my opinion, this woman, she knew she was on TV, and I think she wanted to be as dramatic as possible. And I think it had a lot more to do with her wanting the fame than her wanting actual justice. Now, Susan did do a lot of shady shit in this situation, so I'm going to go over that now. So Susan had got a dolly that they had in their house, which is, a dolly is like those, you push it if you're moving boxes. You know the thing that Hannibal Lecter is in when he's going onto the plane in Silence of the Lambs? That is kind of how she moved his body. She put him on something similar to that dolly, and she took him out into the backyard, and she put him in the hole that he had dug for the fountain. So you could say, in more than one way, Jeff dug his own grave. Susan put him in the hole, covered him with some dirt. Susan then did her best to clean up the crime scene. She had moved the mattress outside to try to clean it, and she'd actually repainted parts of the bedroom trying to cover up the blood, and she had bleached part of the carpet. She thought she had done a pretty good job cleaning up the crime scene. She didn't. So after Susan had cleaned up the crime scene, she went and she emptied the couple's joint bank account. She changed the answering machine. So instead of, "Hi, you've reached Jeff and Susan," she changed it to, "Hi, you've reached Susan." And she also went and filed her first DV report with the police. And the fact that she had never gone to the police to report Jeff before would come up a lot in her trial. But people who are abused, when they contact the police don't seem to really have a vested interest in really going after people who abuse their partners. And a piece of paper is not going to keep you safe. And Susan had just always felt like going to the police was not an option for her. So as I had mentioned, Jeff had been tied to the bed. They could tell in the autopsy that there was ligature marks on his wrists and his ankles. So Susan said that while she was in the middle of killing Jeff, their son woke up. So she said that she had tied Jeff to the bed because she believed that he could come back to life and kill her. And then she went and put her son back to bed. She went to the kitchen and got a second knife, went back to the bedroom, and continued inflicting more injuries on Jeff. After all of this, Susan didn't really know what to do because it wasn't a premeditated murder. She had not planned to do this. She saw her 4-year-old son get punched and it just flipped a switch in her, and she knew that that was her only option, or what she felt was her only option. On January 18th, 5 days after the murder, Susan called her lawyer and asked him to come to her home to talk to her. When the lawyer got there, she told the lawyer that she had killed Jeff and that his body was buried in the backyard. Obviously, the lawyer contacted the police to let them know that there was a body in the backyard of Susan and Jeff's home, and it was Jeff. And Susan turned herself into police on January 24th. 13 months after her arraignment, Susan Wright's trial began on February 24th, 2004. She had already pled not guilty by reason of self-defense. I'm not sure how legally you would claim self-defense with that many wounds, but I do believe that she did kill him in self-defense, not legally speaking, because obviously legally speaking, you can only kill someone in self-defense if your life is in immediate danger, which I do believe her life was in immediate danger, but you can't then stab them 193 times. But I think Susan really did do this to protect herself and protect her children. And though legally, I don't believe it can be considered self-defense, I think it was self-defense in her mind and in a lot of people's minds. I really believe that she killed Jeff to protect her children because she had been being abused by Jeff for a very, very long time, from the beginning of their relationship. It wasn't until he hit one of the children that she killed him. He was actually killed the night that he had punched the 4-year-old. So I really do believe Susan, and I do believe that she killed him to protect her children. Now, being held responsible legally is a very different situation. And as I had mentioned earlier, the assistant district attorney was trying to say that Susan had killed Jeff for his life insurance, which was $200,000, which was, I don't even think she believed it, to be honest with you. If you look at the situation, she was not doing this for money. Was she in the wrong? Yes, because you can't just kill people, obviously. And this DA woman who was so dramatic because I think she liked being on TV, she actually, in her closing arguments, brought their actual bed, like Jeff and Susan's bed, into the courtroom, got on the bed, and mimicked stabbing someone 193 times. And I think she just really enjoyed being on TV. And Susan's testimony throughout the trial is just absolutely heartbreaking. She got up on the stand, and in my opinion, you could tell right away when she started talking about what was actually going on in that household, she was telling the truth. And she, on the stand, said as soon as she started stabbing him, she couldn't stop herself. She was so afraid he was going to come back to life and she didn't want to die. And I believe in that moment, she really did believe that. But you still can't do what you did. So as much sympathy as I have for Susan and her situation, I do think she deserved to spend some time in prison for what she had done. On March 3rd, 2004, Susan was found guilty of murder. When the case got to the sentencing period, the DA wanted 55 years for her to go to prison for 55 years. I think that was ridiculous. The defense wanted her to get probation. I as well think that was ridiculous. She ended up getting sentenced to 25 years in prison. In 2005, Susan tried to appeal her conviction, but it was denied. Then in 2008, Susan appealed her sentence. So what this is not a case where she is trying to say, I'm not guilty or guilty. She's already convicted of murder. What she is appealing is the sentence. So she is appealing the 25-year sentence that she was given. And she was granted an appeal on the sentence because it was found she had ineffective counsel during the punishment phase of the trial. Appealing your sentence is a very risky move because you could end up being given more time to serve. You could be given less time, or you could be given time served and let go. But this was definitely a risk. For the appeal, there was a new witness. There was a woman named Misty who had actually had a 4-year relationship with Jeff before he had been in a relationship with Susan. So Misty and Jeff had been together in a 4-year relationship, and they were actually engaged at one point. So Misty came and testified, and she confirmed what I think most people knew, that Jeff was an extremely, extremely abusive man. She said that she was thrown down the stairs by him many, many times, and he would punch, just absolutely just horrific things. And the thing about Misty, if you see her in the trial, is she's a little bit mouthy. Usually when people go to court, they kind of put on their best behavior. But Misty was just there to confirm that, yes, Jeff was an abusive asshole. And she had, it was entertaining because she would yell at the prosecution. If the prosecution asked her a question, asked her to clarify, like there were several times where she would just yell at the prosecutor. The judge actually had to speak to her and say, you can't keep screaming at the prosecutor. And the reason I'm laughing about this is because I think the prosecutor was just so ridiculous. Normally, if somebody is testifying, especially for something like a murder sentence, you should be very serious and follow the rules of court. But in this case, I liked seeing Misty. Also in the second trial, Susan's mother admitted that she had been abused by her husband, and Susan had witnessed this her entire life. In the original trial, Susan's dad was still alive. So Susan's mom was not going to sit on the stand with her husband in the audience watching. And I always feel weird saying audience because it's not like the people sitting watching in court. I don't know what to call it other than an audience. If you know the correct word for that, could you let me know? Because I would love to have the correct word. I could just Google that shit. Anyways, okay. Sorry, Carolyn, focus. So the mom was not going to sit and have her abuser watching and admit that he was abusing her, because she would have been probably in a very dangerous situation when she had to go home with him at the end of it. But by the second trial, he had actually passed away. He passed away of natural causes. So she was able at this point to testify and say that, yes, she had been in an abusive relationship and Susan's father had abused her Susan's entire life. On November 10th, 2010, Susan's sentence was reduced from 25 years to 20 years. Susan was denied parole in 2014 and in 2017. But then on December 30th, 2020, Susan, at the age of 44, was released on parole. The two children of Susan and Jeff had been raised by Jeff's brother, so hopefully Jeff's brother is the complete opposite of Jeff and the children were raised in a loving home. But one of the most heartbreaking things for me in this story was that one of the conditions when Susan was released from prison was she was not allowed to have any contact with her children. And I completely understand why that would have been a condition when she was released, but she, just on a personal level, she had just spent all these years in prison and it was to protect herself and her children. So hopefully when they become adults and can make the decision for themselves, hopefully Susan will get to be reunited. But I think whatever those children choose to do is their choice and that should be respected. So I would love to know what you guys think and what you think Susan's sentence should have been, if she should have got one at all. I think probably like 5 to maybe 10 years would have been appropriate, but I obviously don't make these kinds of decisions. And I really hope that now that Susan is out of prison, I really hope that she's doing well. And I hope the rest of her life is a lot easier than the part of her life that she spent with Jeff. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you would like to see more from me, please subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel, stick around and watch another video. And I will see you in the next one.